Welcome back to our analysis of Daniel chapter 11. We are finishing off our breakdown of verses 40 to 45. In the previous video, we spoke about the 7th Syrian War, which never actually took place, and we showed that Daniel is trying to portray Antiochus IV as Gog of Magog from the book of Ezekiel, who appears at the end of times to battle Israel. In this video, we're going to see this again as Daniel describes the death of Antiochus IV. Before we jump into the content, I just want to take a moment to thank my patrons who make these videos possible. Remember, the goal of this channel is to create a library of videos that objectively analyze the Bible. If that's something you consider important, can I encourage you to become a patron today? If you do so, you will receive access to all my full videos. All right, let's now get back into the content. So, we were just describing in the previous video the 7th Syrian War, which is not actually historical. Daniel tells us that Ptolemy initiates this war by attacking Antiochus, but then Antiochus retaliates and pushes Ptolemy back into Egypt and actually manages to conquer all of Egypt. And then in verse 44, we read the following: "But reports from the east and north shall alarm him," that is Antiochus, "and he shall go out with great fury to bring ruin and complete destruction to many." End quote. So here we're told that Antiochus will hear reports from the north and the east, and this will alarm him. Now, this is very interesting because this is actually real history for a moment, because Artaxerxes of Armenia in about this time really does revolt against Antiochus. So in the midst of all of this inaccurate history in verses 40 to 45, here in verse 44, we have a nugget of truth. As Evans writes in his book, quote, "The author of Daniel 11 apparently heard of the sedition of Artaxerxes in Armenia and of the bad news that reached Antiochus from Persia. In particular, the words, quote, rumors from the east and the north in Daniel 11:44 are too specific as to deny that reports concerning the international political situation influenced him when he composed this section of Daniel 11:40 to 45. End quote. So to put it simply, Daniel must have known about this revolt of Artaxerxes in order to write 11:44. It's just too specific to be a guess. Maybe Artaxerxes, when Daniel was writing, hadn't revolted yet, but there was kind of rumors in the air that he was about to revolt. So Daniel has made this correct prediction. So it's just something to keep in mind there. It is very interesting. Okay, so when Antiochus hears of this revolt in the east and the north, he begins to go up to put it down. And he stops in Israel. We read this in verse 45. "He, Antiochus, shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the beautiful holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end with no one to help him." End quote. Okay, so we're told here that Antiochus pitches his tent between the sea, which is a reference to the Mediterranean, and the holy mountain, which would be an obvious reference to Mount Zion, where the temple is. As Newsom writes, quote, "The location of the event is specified as between the seas," apparently a term for the Mediterranean, "and the beautiful holy mountain, clearly a designation of Mount Zion." End quote. Verse 45 then tells us that it is at this location that Antiochus will, quote, "come to his end," and that no one will help him. And what this is saying is that Antiochus will die between the sea and Mount Zion. So Antiochus is going to die in Israel. Now, we have a huge problem on our hands. This is incorrect. Antiochus does not die in Israel. Rather, he dies in Persia. Let's remind ourselves of the accurate history here, which we went over in a previous video. Remember, Artaxerxes in Armenia revolts. Antiochus goes to put down this rebellion, but he needs money to fund this fight. So he hears of a temple down in Ilmas, which is full of money. So Antiochus decides to go down to this temple and to plunder it. But the people of the temple fight against Antiochus, and Antiochus is forced to retreat to a place known as Tabai. And it's here that he dies. So as you can see, according to real history, Antiochus dies in the east. He does not die in Israel. As Hartman writes, it is a matter of historical record, however, that Antiochus died in Persia between the 20th of November and the 19th of December, 164 BC. End quote. So now we have a question on our hands. Why does Daniel 11:40 to 45 say Antiochus will die in Israel? And yet again, the most likely answer to this question is that Daniel is drawing upon the book of Ezekiel, which tells us that in the final battle of history, Gog of Magog is going to die in Israel. And we read this in Ezekiel 39, which reads, quote, "And you, mortal, prophesy against Gog, and say, Thus says the Lord God, I am against you, O Gog, chief of Meshech and Tubal. I will turn you around and drive you forward and bring you up from the remotest parts of the north, and lead you against the mountains of Israel. On that day, I will give to Gog a place for burial in Israel, the valley of the travelers east of the sea." End quote. I find this passage absolutely incredible. Not only are we told that Gog will die in Israel, but the language here is very similar to what we find in Daniel 11. Gog dies near the mountains of Israel and east of the sea. This is almost identical to what we read in Daniel chapter 11. So yet again, it seems that Daniel is trying to draw parallels between Gog and Antiochus. Newsom writes, quote, "The location would fit, at least in a general sense, the place of Gog's demise on the, quote, mountains of Israel, Ezekiel 38-39. We also read in Hartman, quote, "For the locale of Antiochus' death, the inspired author selected the hill country to the west of Jerusalem, because in the last days, the final enemies of God's people would fall on the mountains of Israel, Ezekiel 38, or be judged in the vicinity of Jerusalem, Joel 3, Zechariah 14. Finally, in his commentary on the book of Ezekiel, Cook writes the following, which I find absolutely great. Quote, "The echoes of Ezekiel 38-39 in Daniel 11:36-45 form one of the most interesting reappearances of the Gog prophecy in the Bible. This concluding section of the vision of history in Daniel 11:1-45 turns away from Antiochus Epiphanes to prophesy the death of an end-time tyrant who, unlike Antiochus, dies inside Judea. The Gog prophecies of Ezekiel 38-39 loom very close to the surface of the Daniel passage." He continues, "Daniel 11:45 closely follows the picture of Ezekiel 39:11 of Gog's final end east of the sea, that is the Mediterranean Sea, just as in Ezekiel, the tyrant meets his defeat between the sea and the beautiful holy mountain." End quote. Okay, let's now return to our overview of Daniel 11. As we said, verses 3-39 of Daniel 11 aligns perfectly with history, and that's because Daniel is drawing upon the historical records of his time. But then in verses 40-45, it's all historically inaccurate. And this is because Daniel is attempting to make actual predictions about the future. And it is clear that Daniel is being inspired by the book of Ezekiel, particularly the Gog prophecies, which foretells of a battle that will occur at the end of the world. It's clear that verses 40-45 of the book of Daniel is describing this end of the world. The opening verse of this section, verse 40, begins by saying, "At the time of the end," clearly indicating we're at the time of the end. It says it right there. Likewise, in verses 3-39, we're only concerned about the king of the north and the king of the south. But all of a sudden, starting at verse 40, we care about all of these other nations, remembering that the final battle of history, according to the Hebrew Bible, is going to involve all of the nations of the world. And finally, in describing the death of Antiochus, Daniel is going to draw upon the description of Gog's death, as found in Ezekiel 39. Okay, everyone, we are all done. We have done really the unthinkable. We have completed a verse-by-verse analysis of Daniel chapter 11. Let's take a deep breath. We've done it. But we are not done yet. We now need to begin working on Daniel chapter 12 because it follows right on. The break between 11 and 12 in our Bibles is totally artificial. Chapter 12 follows right on from chapter 11. I finally just want to thank my patrons and YouTube members. You make these videos possible. Thank you so much. Can you make sure you hit that like button, leave me a comment, and you're subscribed? Thank you for watching until the end, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.